Hello everyone, welcome to Chapter 3. Chapter 3 looks at attitudes, functions, and consequences. And as we've been learning, the relationship between attitudes and behaviors is not quite as simple as we may think. And so what this means is that there are several factors and issues that can mediate the relationship or moderate the relationship between the attitudes people carry and what they end up actually doing. So this chapter is going to explore some of those issues, and we're also going to look at some of the reasoning behind why it is that the attitudes that we have shape our behavior. So let's get started. Functional theory looks at why it is that we hold the attitudes that we have and what broader purpose or function these attitudes may serve in terms of giving us motivation to fulfill various behaviors in life. So we can think about the attitudes that we have, let's say attitudes towards education or attitudes towards independence or hard work, and imagine for a moment that you did not have those attitudes in place. So for example, if you did not have an attitude that valued education, or at least valued what a college education can do for you in terms of gainful career employment. So if you did not have these attitudes in place, then the entire process of attending college and completing classes successfully would probably be much harder because you didn't already have these attitudes in place that emphasize a value of the university educational experience. So we can think about this idea that attitudes serve a very functional purpose in our life. Now, in a world where people don't have attitudes already in place about various ideas or ideologies or values, right? In that kind of a world, we would be weighing the costs and the benefits of every single decision in our life to determine whether it was a useful course of action for us. So clearly, this is not a realistic solution for most human beings because it would take too much mental energy to have to assess every single interaction or every single encounter and to gauge where we want to go in terms of behavior and attitudes towards that issue or stance. So we have attitudes already in place. Oftentimes they're in place from our socialization, such as the family system, the community we come from, the culture we come from. And these attitudes give us a roadmap, if you will, for how to manage life. And so in many ways, attitudes are very useful. It's a very normal human process. And so now we're going to explore some of the intricate details of why it is that certain attitudes are predictive of behavior, while other attitudes may not necessarily predict behavior. Functional theory suggests that when you are able to address the attitude functions that people have, or basically the purpose for why they hold the attitudes they have, then you can design messages that will be more persuasive in terms of changing thought, belief, or behavior. Doing so allows people to support their individual needs, and as we know, all of us are different. Each person has their own unique values, approaches, ways of looking at the world. And so this theory allows us to unpack, if you will, some of the functions that people may have for the attitudes they carry. And when we can start to identify why it is that people have the attitudes they have, then we are able to develop messages or persuasive campaigns or communication that is able to reach more people and a broader audience. So for example, your book talks about the process of community volunteering. And they talk about the fact that although you may have a group of people show up to volunteer at a given event or at an organization or for a purpose or function, each of these individuals that are there may actually have a unique purpose or function for why they are actually volunteering. And so we're going to go into these several different potential functions that people may have here in a second. In a few moments, I'm also going to be playing a clip, which is a public service announcement from the American Humane Society, and you're going to get to see a public service announcement that is addressing a wide group of people, and that they're also using different function targets in their message. And so we were going to watch that in a few minutes. And so before we get into that, we're going to talk through some of the different functions so that you can apply the various functions or be looking for them as you watch the video in a few slides. So let's go and look at some of these different functions of attitudes. So there are several attitude functions, and we're going to go through each of them one by one, and then you'll get a chance to watch a public service announcement about the Humane Society and volunteering there, and you can see and start to look for the different types of functions that they're targeting in the message that we're going to watch. So one of the first functions of attitudes is for knowledge. Attitudes help us to make sense of the world, and they help us to understand what takes place in life. They give us a way to look at the world with, if you will, a roadmap or an overarching framework. And sometimes the world can be a pretty intimidating place for people. So the knowledge that we have, which informs attitudes that we carry, is something that serves as an important function in the ability of human beings to make sense of the world and to be able to predict the world and what may happen in their day-to-day life. We can look at things like religion, for example, as a type of function or attitude process that allows people to feel a sense of meaning or connection to people around them, to the universe, to their creator. And a lot of times, religion or spirituality is something that allows people an emotional or spiritual sort of crutch to lean on, if you will, right? So when life gets difficult and we can't quite make sense of why things might be happening that are undesirable or unfortunate, we can look into the religious principles that we may have close to our heart, or at least a broader framework of religious principles, even if we're not highly religious or highly involved. And we can try to make sense of things through a broader framework, such as, well, everything happens for a reason, or we know that our creator of the universe is in charge and we don't maybe understand why things happen, but ultimately it's for our good down the road, right? So this would be one way that people would use knowledge about religion to help make sense of a life that in some cases or in some ways can seem like it doesn't always make sense. There's also a utilitarian attitude function, and this is primarily the desire to have more rewards in life and to avoid punishment in life. So, for example, your book gives kind of an interesting scenario where they talk about how students who are smart but consider themselves mathematically challenged say that it is functional for them to develop a positive attitude towards a statistics or math course. The reason that this positive attitude is useful is because they feel that the enthusiasm they have may enhance the professor's view of them, which could cause the professor to like them more. They also realize that they'll be able to have more motivation to do well in the course if they have a good attitude towards it. So this is one of the reasons why it is generally a good idea to work to cultivate a positive attitude towards things. Sometimes it might take some cognitive restructuring to do that. But when I say cognitive restructuring, you're basically talking about reframing things so that you can see a bright side or look for the silver lining in a situation, even if it's challenging. So we do see that attitudes function the utilitarian purpose and the human need or desire to avoid punishment but enhance rewards. We also see that attitudes function to help us be adjusted socially to the people that we care about or want to belong to. So attitudes allow us to be accepted by other people. They help us adjust to different reference groups that we see ourselves as belonging to or maybe want to belong to, right? So in some cases, people may actually be persuaded to take on attitudes that they're not actually in agreement with, but they do so because the groups that they're connected to promote that attitude. So this is something always to look at in our life when we may actually take on attitudes that we don't individually believe in. And I would encourage you all to look at any kinds of situations where you feel like this might be taking place. And it's generally a good idea to try to be as authentic and in alignment with ourselves as we can. So you can look at that in terms of a persuasive process that may be going on with you in terms of your self-persuasion that perhaps you hadn't realized was happening. Now, maybe some of us are very conscious about the fact that we're playing a role, so to speak, and going along with the herd. But on the other hand, sometimes it's good to look at how this might be playing out in various situations in our life and to evaluate whether we want to continue to align with that or if we want to make different choices. So these are 3 of the ways that attitudes function in our lives. We're going to go through 3 more functions here in a second, and then we'll get on to that video clip from the Humane Society. Another function of attitudes is that they allow us to express our social identity. So the attitudes that we carry may indicate or represent the different types of group memberships we carry or status we have, for example. Perhaps the attitudes that we have may indicate our wealth standing or maybe other things about how we are unique. So your book talks about the fact that people hold attitudes to communicate who they are and what they aspire to be. So, for example, when we look at people who are very concerned with material possessions, driving the new car that is high status, perhaps luxury vehicles or vehicles that are popular in that current culture, right? Or you look at the desire for people, some people have to have a lot of jewelry, diamonds, gold, things like that. Or perhaps other types of clothing or decorations like tattoos is a very well-established aspect of social identity. And tattoos actually serve a function of creating a sense of uniqueness for the people that have them as well. So there is definitely a unique culture that goes along with various types of attitudes and, of course, behaviors, right? So that's one way that we can see that attitudes serve a social identity function, which of course is not the same as the membership, feeling socially connected or socially belonging. That's different, right? If I have an attitude because my friends feel that way and I want to fit in, that's different than me having an attitude about a certain type of expression that might be physical or material, right? And manifesting that. That's something that's more projected outward onto the world versus my desire to belong to a community or a collective unit. Okay, so just wanted to distinguish between numbers 3 and 4 there. The value expressive function of attitudes is another important reason why people tend to hold on to attitudes that they perceive to be core values. And so it's interesting to think about in terms of things like legal issues, the ways that people view the environment. Your book talks about this idea of capital punishment, and I'm going to read you a quote here from page 83. It says, "Some individuals claim that they favor capital punishment because they value law and order. They support affirmative action programs as a means of promoting equality. They support recycling programs because they value the environment. And they frown on cheating because it is dishonest." Okay, so you can see that these types of actions, all right, have different attitudes assigned to them. And each of those attitudes are based on a value that people may have, right? A value towards promoting equality, a value towards the environment, a value towards honesty. Okay, so the value expressive function is definitely an important attitude function that influences how we perceive of our attitudes and, of course, behave based on those attitudes. And then finally, the ego defensive function of attitudes is one aspect of our attitude functions that allow us to actually have a type of defense, if you will, against different unpleasant emotions that maybe we don't feel like we want to consciously feel or acknowledge or experience, right? So, for example, people may take on different attitudes that they didn't have before to prevent them from feeling emotionally or psychologically uncomfortable with the reality of their life or a situation, right? And so your book gives an interesting example that we could talk about, especially with a college-age population. They talk about a young woman who decides that she's going to break up with her boyfriend. She sees that the relationship is not really going anywhere, and she is basically just waiting for him to break up with her after college because the relationship seems a little stagnant. So she still has feelings for him, but in order to defend against these feelings and to make her position known, she basically declares that the relationship is over, and she takes on a hostile attitude towards the boyfriend because it's a functional attitude that actually helps give her the strength to call off the romance. So this is an interesting self-persuasive tactic that people may be using in some cases without even being aware of it. And I wonder if we think about our own lives and we think about the various relationships that we have had or experienced, and I wonder if any of us have done this before, where maybe we just are able to allow ourselves to move on more rapidly if we automatically take on a negative attitude towards a person or maybe a group that we didn't get accepted with or accepted in or something like that. I think it's certainly worth considering. And although I'm not encouraging that we sit and wallow in sorrow when things don't go our way, I do believe that it's important for us to be emotionally conscious about what we're doing. And so I would encourage you to look at this, especially the ego defensive function of attitudes, along with all of the others. These are all very important. But you can never underestimate the power of self-persuasion, and sometimes it may actually be happening without us even realizing it. And I think that that's especially interesting to think about in terms of the persuasive process. In your textbook, there is a fairly lengthy discussion about the motivations that often promote volunteering behavior among people. And what's interesting about this discussion is that they find that there are several different types of motivations that people may draw from in terms of why they spend time volunteering at a local charity or serving the environment or with, let's say, the Humane Society or other types of social community organizations. So one of the reasons why people volunteer is because of their values. They have been taught the value of serving, that serving your community is something that you should do. And there's also probably values associated with community involvement there. In addition, there are values associated with the actual target that they are volunteering at. So for example, if you're choosing to volunteer with the environment, clearly the environment is something that you value, and that's a value that you want to promote. So the values is one reason. Another reason why people may choose to volunteer their time for more community service engagement is the belief of reciprocity. And so from this framework, people perceive that volunteering time to a function or to some people that may need some help or to some kind of a purpose may actually end up helping them in the long run, because what goes around comes around. So it's that idea of reciprocity and mutual reciprocity in our community. You can also think about the desire to volunteer as being motivated by recognition, or the recognition that people may receive when they volunteer for something that is a larger purpose than just self-serving. So that may be another reason. A fourth reason why people may volunteer is because they have a genuine desire or are motivated to learn more or understand more about a various issue or a various group or target population or something like that, or maybe a social justice issue. So as you can see, the idea of volunteering because of reciprocity is a very different motive than volunteering because you genuinely want to understand something and learn about it. People may also volunteer because of self-esteem or the feeling of worth that they get or feeling good about themselves when they're spending time dedicated to serving something other than themselves or a broader purpose. So these are all reasons why people may volunteer, and there are a few more we're going to go through on the next slide. A sixth reason why people may volunteer is for reactivity. Reactivity deals with the attitude or the motive that is based on healing the past. So, for example, people sometimes who may have lost their partner in life, or maybe are elderly and they don't have as many social networks as they would like, they may volunteer their time in order to heal their past or heal their loneliness or heal a sense of loss that they experience from losing a partner or not having their family around. A seventh reason why people choose to volunteer, according to your textbook and the research that's cited, is because of social conforming with others. This is again a socially motivated function, and this is again related to the desire to feel like they belong to a group or like they fit in with a group. And of course, that sense of belonging is perhaps a motivation for a lot of people to take on volunteering and also to take on attitudes of various types. An eighth potential reason why people may volunteer would be a protective reason, and this is primarily to reduce perceptions of guilt that people may have. It's unclear what the guilt may be motivated by, but for each person, clearly it's going to be different. For some people, maybe they feel guilty because they are privileged in life, and maybe they perceive that they don't do enough to give back of their time or money. For other people, maybe they've had an experience in life that they feel bad about, and they're trying to sort of eliminate that negative guilt that they have by trying to make a positive difference for a community of people that are needy. It's unsure why each person would experience that protective function, but again, this is a potential reason why people might volunteer. Another reason is that some people may really want to broaden their social and interactional networks. If you're interested in a given cause, let's say you want to promote greater health screening or greater donations for children who have health problems, then you can spend your time volunteering at an organization who has fundraisers, and maybe they have marathons to raise money. And that's a value that you have, and that would be people that you get to meet who would share similar values that you could join or have in your social network. And finally, many people may find themselves volunteering for career development and for learning all of the skills that they might need in a future job. So these are some of the reasons why people volunteer. This list is certainly not exhaustive, but there may be other reasons, but this is certainly a fairly thorough assessment of motivations that people may have for volunteering. So in terms of persuasion, what this means is that if we are trying to target the public, for example, to enlist of their time and money to help an organization, then given that 100 or 1,000 people may be motivated by very different attitudes or different functions of attitudes to do the volunteering, what this means for us as persuasion experts is it means that we have to develop messages that are going to be able to target people who have different motivations. So in the next slide, I'm going to ask you a few questions that I would like you to just jot down. You will not be expected to complete an assignment on these questions, but I did want to give you folks some practical application of some of the ideas and concepts we're talking about. And I think that viewing an effective public service announcement is a really great way to apply some of these topics that we're talking about. So moving on to the next slide, and then we will be getting to the Humane Society public service announcement about volunteering. In order to give you an opportunity to apply some of the ideas that we've been discussing, I have a public service announcement that I would like you all to watch, and I would like you to focus on looking for the following issues as you think they are playing out in the public service announcement. This is a PSA that was developed by the Humane Society of America, and I would like you to think about and assess how does this PSA develop ethos, pathos, and logos? What types of volunteer motivations are being targeted? What types of demographic groups are being targeted based on what we see in the video? Do you think the PSA is effective? And finally, explain why or why not. This is just an exercise to do on your own. You do not have to turn anything in for it. And the link for the video that I would like you all to watch is included right here. So take a few moments. The video is about 3 minutes. Watch the video that you'll find on this link, and then please continue the rest of the slideshow. Thank you. Hopefully you all enjoyed that touching and heartwarming video by the Humane Society. As you probably were able to distinguish by watching it, they do a very good job of connecting with the ethos, logos, and pathos component of persuasion. They used facts and figures. They had adorable little animals connecting with human beings, so there was an emotional connection. They had several people that seemed like they were credible sources talking about the volunteering. They also did a good job in that public service announcement of having a wide variety of people from different walks of life doing a wide variety of different types of volunteer activities. And so, in my opinion, I believe that that public service announcement would be very effective, reaching a wide variety of individuals who would be motivated by several different potential functions of an attitude or a desire to volunteer. And so I think it's a pretty effective campaign. Of course, you're entitled to your own opinion, but you did see how the types of information that they provided and the different types of scenarios that they depicted were able to connect to the various types of functions that we just talked about in terms of why people might volunteer. So for example, one thing I noticed in the clip that they did is they had groups of people walking dogs together, right? So that type of a social scenario that's being depicted does a really good job of targeting people that might be volunteering so that they can feel like they belong to a group or like they have social belonging, or it might also target people who would like to expand their social networks and their networks. So you can also think about how they had people who were vet technicians talking and people that worked at the Humane Society talking. That would do a good job targeting people that might be considering going into animal care in terms of a career choice. And so those people would be targeted because the PSA depicts people just like them having fun volunteering. So I'd like you to think of some other ways and some other types of functions in terms of volunteer motivations that you believe the PSA met, drawing from the ideas that I just discussed with you. I'm sure you can go and still find another 2 or 3 different types of groups that were targeted in terms of the motivation functions for volunteering. Another thing that I thought the PSA did exceptionally well on was that they used that PSA as an opportunity to thank the current volunteers that have already dedicated time and money to the Humane Society. So they talk all about what the volunteers did, and then at the end of the clip, they say, "Thank you, volunteers." I'm not sure if you caught that, but that was very effective as well, because you're not only reaching out to new volunteers, but you're also thanking and validating and giving gratitude to all of the people that have already dedicated time to serving your organization. And at the end of the clip, they did a very good job of reinforcing the value that the Humane Society has of making the world a more humane place for animals. And of course, that is an overarching value that somebody would have that would cause them to want to volunteer as well. So in my opinion, overall, I believe that this PSA was very effectively developed. It is likely that there was some research that went into something like this. And in fact, the case is that most advertisers and companies do research about these types of public campaigns before they actually end up delivering them on a mass-mediated level. So it was a great example. I hope that it was useful for you folks in terms of applying some of these ideas. And for the remainder of the lecture, we have a couple of theories to talk through. And we're going to go through those fairly quickly because I do believe you can read through them in the textbook, but I am going to talk through them nonetheless, just so that there is a clear understanding of what each theory brings to the table And you can be consulting these theories, of course, when you develop your persuasive campaigns so that you can target the desired group that you're targeting in terms of what types of motivations they may have for their attitudes. So in terms of attitude characteristics, it's important to be aware of the fact that there are general attitudes, such as the attitude of valuing the environment, and of course, there are much more specific attitudes, such as I choose to specifically go pick up trash if I work with a company that's doing volunteering service or an organization that's volunteering, or if I'm walking at the park and I see random trash pieces sitting on the grass, I may just go pick up the trash and put it in the trash can because I don't want a bird or some other animal to ingest it and be, get ill or something. So that's the difference between general versus specific characteristics. But there also tends to be a compatibility principle with regards to general attitudes. And so the relationship between general attitudes is that our generalized attitudes are much more likely to predict behaviors that we will enact across various situations, whereas our specific attitudes tend to be much more specifically located in a given time, place, or context. And of course, what we know from before is that strong attitudes tend to be the best predictors of behavior. Some of the moderating issues that may shape the things that people end up doing despite the attitudes that they have are things like situational factors, for example. So, what are the various social norms and roles that I have been trained to accept as normal or routine? And do my attitudes towards a certain behavior align with those norms and roles, or do they violate them, right? So if my attitude towards something is going to put me in a situation where I have to go against the grain and stick out or seem like I'm abnormal, I may not actually express that attitude or behave in a way where that attitude is being manifested. Another thing that influences how attitudes play out are the scripts that we carry. And the scripts, of course, deal with the expectations that we have about the various events that are taking place in our life. So we have various ideas about how things should go, for example, and if things don't go that way, then we may have an attitude that kicks into play, and that may shape how we feel about that various situation or maybe the person that was involved in it or things like that. Characteristics of the person is another moderating issue that we want to be aware of. So what's interesting about persuasion is this issue of self-monitoring. Now, self-monitoring is the ability to monitor the way that we're behaving. So what are we saying and doing in the moment as we're doing them? And it also includes our ability to gauge the effect that we're having on the people that we're interacting with. So people that are high self-monitors tend to have a lower attitude, behavior, consistency. Let me say that one more time. People that are high self-monitors, so they're good at being aware of what they're saying and doing, and they're monitoring and they're changing what they say and do depending on what they think is appropriate and depending on what the people around them are doing in response. High self-monitors, there tends to be a low attitude behavior consistency for high self-monitors. Another thing that's interesting is that people who have direct experience with something tend to be much more established or defined in terms of the attitudes that they have. This makes sense because if we have knowledge about something or we believe we have a lot of knowledge about something, then we're going to hold on to the attitudes we have because we think that they're correct. So this is something that we want to be conscious of. These are certainly some moderating issues that are worth thinking about when you are working to persuade people. And let's move on to a couple of theories that also look at the relationship between attitudes and behaviors and how that relationship plays out. The theory of reasoned action suggests that there are several variables or issues that will contribute to people's attitudes towards behaviors, the importance of those attitudes, and whether they intend to behave a certain way. According to the theory of reasoned action, people develop beliefs about behaviors or attitudes about behaviors based on beliefs about the behavior and their expectation or the evaluation of the outcome. So in the model that's on page 96, you can look at the boxes that start on the far left, and the top two boxes in that model indicate the behavioral belief and the outcome evaluation. And those two factors end up shaping or contributing to the attitude that people develop about a behavior. Another thing that the theory of reasoned action addresses are perceptions of subjective norms. So subjective norms are based on the normative beliefs that people have, and these are beliefs that specific references, and references include people that we know or care about, like family or parents or friends. These are the beliefs that certain people that we care about think that we should or should not perform a certain behavior. Okay, so this would include perceptions that our parents might have about, maybe things that we spend our leisure time doing, or people we hang out with, or things like that. And of course, the motivation to comply with these references will of course shape perceptions of subjective norms. So if I perceive, for example, that my parents don't approve of me doing something, and I am motivated to comply with my parents because I care about their approval and I want to have a good relationship with them, then according to this theory, that should influence the subjective norm, which will indicate or which will lean social pressure on me to behave in a more desirable way rather than in an undesirable way. So according to the theory of reasoned action, the behavioral belief and outcome evaluations contribute to the attitude towards the behavior. The normative beliefs and the motivation I have to please or to make people happy around me will contribute to the subjective norm of social pressure. And then, of course, subjective norms and attitudes will contribute to the behavioral intention, which ultimately will influence whether a behavior is performed or not. On the next slide, we're going to look at a model of it, and we can talk through it a little bit more in case there are any areas of confusion. As you can see here, this is a fairly detailed model of the theory of reasoned action. You see up here that there are certain beliefs that the behavior that we're doing will lead to certain outcomes. According to this model, this should influence the attitude that we have. The attitude that we carry towards the behavior is also influenced by our evaluation of the outcomes, whether it's positive or negative, if we engage in a certain behavior. Another thing that this theory contributes is this idea of specific references, or these are people that we care about, and whether they think that the behavior should be performed or not. And then, of course, our motivation to comply with the specific reference that we're influenced by. These things tend to shape subjective norms, and the attitude towards the behavior, the importance of the attitude and normative considerations, and the subjective norms will shape the intention that somebody has, and of course that will shape behavior. So for example, if we were going to use this model to try to apply it to a campaign, we would really want to do some research to find out our target population's beliefs about outcomes associated with certain behaviors. You also want to find out which type of references this person is more connected to. Because if you design a campaign trying to keep teenagers from smoking cigarettes because their parents will disapprove, and you might find by doing the research that the people that the teenagers want to please are not the parents, but their social groups, right? Then you would want to design a campaign that addresses the fact that their reference group, these boxes right here, okay, on the left, the reference group that should be evoked in that campaign targeting those high school students would be their social group and what the social group thinks of them, not the parents. So these are very important details about why it is that people may evoke certain behaviors even despite having beliefs, for example, that smoking can lead to negative health outcomes. Moving on to another theory, the theory of planned behavior suggests that behavioral intentions are based on the attitudes that we have towards a certain behavior or an issue, the subjective norms that we perceive exist surrounding that issue, and of course our perceived control with regards to that issue. All of these three things should contribute to behavioral intention according to the theory of planned behavior, and that behavioral intention should lead to behavior. Now, looking at the attitudes that people may have toward an issue, again, you have other things that may predict behavior rather than just attitudes towards the issue. So for example, we can use cigarette smoking among teenagers again. You may be a teenager and you know that cigarette smoke causes negative outcomes. You know that it stinks. You know that there are various things that you will suffer long term or even in the short term because you're smoking cigarettes. However, if all of your friends are smoking cigarettes and you don't perceive that you can quit smoking because you've been smoking for 3 or 4 years already and you feel like you need to have many cigarettes every day, then despite the fact that you have a negative attitude towards the whole issue of smoking cigarettes, you may actually continue to smoke because of the subjective norms of your peer group and also because you perceive that you do not have the control to change the behavior. What this means for persuasive campaigns is that when you're dealing with issues where people might perceive that perceptions of control are not very competent, for example, then you could design a campaign that provides possible resources or ideas for how people could evoke more control or develop more control, such as maybe a hotline, or maybe you could talk about different types of support groups that a high school student could go to quit smoking cigarettes. You might also talk about the Nicoderm patch or the gum or something like that, which would keep them from feeling the craving for it. So knowing these kinds of things can be very influential in terms of our ability to develop effective, persuasive campaigns and, of course, to influence our own behavior as well. Now, as you can see, here is a model of the theory of planned behavior. You see up here in the left top of the model in figure 3.5 that you have an attitude towards the behavior, and then you have the subjective norms of your social group or whatever community you identify strongly with, and then you have your perceived behavioral control. And then all of these things together contribute to behavioral intention, which according to the model should influence behavior. Now clearly subjective norms and perceived control are enough of an influence to outweigh a negative attitude towards a certain behavior. So what we can do to sort of circumvent the tendency for these things to have a lot of control is we can try to minimize the impact of, let's say, subjective norms. So if we know, for example, that high school students are smoking cigarettes because they feel that they can fit in with their peers, then maybe we should develop a campaign that shows a bunch of popular high school students who perceive that cigarette smoking is really gross and that is something that's very undesirable. We may also want to, again, evoke different resources or strategies that somebody who is addicted to cigarettes can use to enhance their perception of behavioral control. And so by addressing these two issues where we might have a weakened tendency to influence behavior, we can hopefully heighten the influence of this negative attitude towards, in this case, smoking, which of course will increase the likelihood that the intention is to quit smoking cigarettes and of course ultimately will change behavior. Accessibility theory suggests that attitudes will predict behavior if we are able to somehow activate the attitude and of course to have it influence the views that we have about that object. So there are several things that need to happen for accessibility theory to play out, or for the process that accessibility theory talks about to play out. The first thing that has to happen is the attitude has to be activated, and this often happens, let's say, when we see a product at the store that we have seen before on advertisements and we like the ads and it makes us feel a positive feeling. So then there's a process of selective perception where we might zone in or hone in on that actual product. At that point, we're going to have perceptions of the attitude object that will remind us of the attitude that we have, the positive feeling towards it. And then according to this theory, if we are able to activate the positive attitudes that we have felt before with regards to that product in watching advertisements or maybe other experiences we've had, then we will have an intention to behave and we will purchase that product. However, things are not always that simple. Sometimes this theory suggests that there are other factors that would influence whether people actually reach for a product that they saw advertised. So, for example, your book talks about a Snickers bar campaign, and that it's highly likely that a woman, for example, who is more in touch with her feelings of happiness or joy that she felt when watching the Snickers Satisfies advertisements, that person who's more in touch with their feelings will actually reach for that product in a more developed way or more frequently than someone who is not in touch with their feelings. The person, presumably, who's not very in touch with their feelings might just stand there for a while and end up choosing a product based on a whim or based on something that's closest to their eye vision level or something like that. So it's interesting because we do see that this idea of attitude activation is something that can take place once a campaign has already established or embedded a positive attitude in someone with regards to a product or an idea. And it's certainly worth thinking about in terms of activating ideas or emotions or perceptions. And accessibility theory is something that we can look at in terms of other ads that we've experienced. So you can think about the Just Do It campaign that Nike came up with. You can think about the WhatsApp Super Bowl campaign that the Budweiser Corporation came up with. And all of these commercials have become quite popular in American pop culture, and they may activate different responses, which of course can lead to purchasing behavior. And so the corporations that develop these advertisements, of course, they spend millions and millions of dollars doing research using these kinds of theories so that they can better understand how it is that they can engender or create in someone a positive attitude towards their product or their company. And in the hopes, of course, that they will be able to have these positive attitudes translate to purchasing behaviors. So in the next slide, we're going to look at a model of accessibility theory quickly, and then we're going to wrap up this lecture. Accessibility theory allows us to look at the role of attitude activation, the way that selective perception can allow people to hone in on a certain product, and how these perceptions will influence immediate perceptions of that object, a perception of a current event or defining of the event as favorable and positive. And of course, ultimately, the theory suggests that this should lead to purchasing behavior. This theory is also useful because it does also account for social norms and the way that our social groups might define a current situation. And so according to this theory, our social groups do play a role in how we tend to perceive various types of products, and those social norms are very influential in persuasion indeed. Although attitudes serve a very important function in allowing us to fulfill the needs that we have, attitudes may sometimes take the role of dysfunctional attitudes, and they may actually start to detract from our ability to meet other needs in our life because we have an attitude that may be dysfunctional with regards to something in our life. So, for example, a positive attitude towards social media and the use of cell phones can certainly keep people connected. It can keep us up and on the know about what's going on in our social community and maybe with current events. It's a great way for us to stay connected, especially if we live far away from our families or friends, right? So we know that there is a positive aspect of a good attitude that we may have towards social media and cell phones. However, the same type of activity can also have a dysfunctional level of attitude associated with it. And so a negative aspect or a dysfunctional attitude associated with social media and cell phones may take the role of someone who is, let's say, obsessed with checking their Facebook updates every minute or every 5 minutes or every 20 minutes, right? It can start to become a type of addiction, if you will, where people are feeling the need to log in, to check updates all the time at the expense potentially of relationships that they may have in the moment, right? So is it possible that some of these social media and cell phones that actually are able to allow us to stay connected in some cases, if they're not managed well, can actually detract from our ability to make meaningful connections because we're so plugged into our phone that we're not giving the time and attention and consideration that we should be to the people that are in our lives in person. Another potential negative there would be that people may become very self-focused on the things that they're posting, maybe, really wanting to always kind of, put their experience out there in a public way and then getting validation from people or getting comments or getting sympathy or support or, whatever it is that motivates some people to post things on social media constantly or to constantly be texting people, things like that. So we can look at the way in which things that can actually serve a very positive function in our life can in some ways turn dysfunctional. And so I would encourage all of us, myself included, to think about what are some other types of attitudes or behaviors that may be functional for some people but may cause dysfunction for others. And are these things that we really want to be thinking about as we move forward in our ability to be persuasive communicators, right? Certainly, our ability to be a persuasive communicator is going to be dependent on our ability to interact effectively with other human beings. And so, looking at any potential behaviors or tendencies or attitudes that may be holding us back is certainly worth our time and ultimately will contribute a more positive effect in terms of our ability to meet the needs of the people in our lives and also to be an effective persuader, whether this persuasion is happening in terms of self-persuasion or motivation, whether it's happening in an interpersonal relationship, or whether it's happening in a public group context or a mass-mediated situation. Thank you for your time and attention in this lecture. I hope that there were some useful things for you to think about, and I will talk to you all in the next chapter.